When India raises questions about America's present motives, it cannot do so in isolation from the weight of history. For just as an individual is shaped by memory, by the experiences, betrayals, and victories that linger in the mind, so too are nations guided by the collective memory of their past interactions. Trust between nations is not created overnight, nor is suspicion. It is the product of decades, sometimes centuries of observation. India has watched America move across the global stage, often cloaked in noble intentions, often promising the universal values of liberty, equality, and justice. Yet behind these promises, India has also seen patterns that suggest something more complicated, something less idealistic and more self-preserving. And this history cannot be ignored, for to ignore it would be to abandon wisdom itself. Think of history as the subconscious of nations. Just as an individual who has been deceived once will hesitate before trusting again, nations too carry the scars of past encounters. America's actions in the Cold War era, its interventions in distant regions under the banner of defending democracy, its shifting alliances when convenient, all of these remain etched into global consciousness. For India, the question is not only about America's current policies, but about whether its motives today are simply a continuation of old patterns dressed in new language. Has America learned, or has it only refined the art of presentation? This burden of memory has consequences. When India looks at present U.S. strategies, whether in trade, defense, or geopolitics, it cannot help but measure them against past behavior. Was not the same language of partnership once used with other nations, only to be abandoned when the winds of interest changed? Did not America once promote ideals abroad while simultaneously undermining governments that refused to serve its designs? History whispers and nations listen. It whispers of Vietnam, of Iraq, of Latin America, of countless places where noble words gave way to ruthless pragmatism, and in this whisper lies the central tension. How can one take present promises at face value without acknowledging the pattern behind them? But India's questioning is not cynicism for its own sake. It is not an act of bitterness, but of maturity. A mature nation does not erase the past to feel comfortable in the present. Instead, it integrates that past, acknowledges the truth of it, and uses it as a compass. By asking what America's past motives were, India is not simply casting doubt on America's present, it is reminding itself to stay awake, to remain conscious, to refuse the seduction of rhetoric that ignores lived reality. Nations, like individuals, must protect themselves from repeating cycles of misplaced trust. This is the philosophical heart of India's position. To question is to remain free. To question is to preserve dignity. And to question is to ensure that history does not quietly repeat itself while we look the other way. For if the past has shown us anything, it is that noble language can often conceal practical ambition. India does not reject America's partnership, but it insists on clarity. Because only when motives are transparent can trust be real, and only when trust is real can progress be lasting. The past is not a chain to hold us back, it is a mirror to help us see more clearly. And if India has the courage to look into that mirror, then it will also have the wisdom to act with discernment. That perhaps is the greatest safeguard against repeating history's mistakes. So the question India poses is simple yet profound. If memory warns us of patterns, do we dare to ignore it? Or do we finally allow it to guide us toward a future shaped not by illusions, but by truth? You said expand key point no 2 into a 500-word segment that flows naturally within the overall speech, aligning seamlessly with the other key points. The tone should be intellectual and authoritative, yet accessible, mirroring approach. The language should be clear and direct, with a focus on psychological and philosophical depth. Avoid any formal headings, keeping the delivery conversational, as if speaking to an audience in a lecture or interview format. Conclude with a powerful, concise closing statement that leaves the audience with something to reflect on, motivating them to act on the insights share. ChatGPT said, when India questions America's past motives, it must look closely at the pattern that emerges between what was said and what was done. For decades, the United States has clothed its actions in the language of noble purpose, freedom, democracy, peace. Yet beneath those words often lay a different truth, the preservation of influence, the protection of markets, the expansion of power. This is not to say that America's rhetoric was always false or meaningless. Ideals have their place, and sometimes they were pursued with sincerity. But when we study history carefully, we see how often these ideals became instruments rather than ends in themselves, tools to legitimize choices that were guided first by self-interest. Consider the Cold War era. America spoke of defending democracy worldwide, of protecting nations from tyranny. But in practice, it supported regimes that had little to do with democratic principles if they served strategic objectives. This was not an isolated instance. It was a pattern. The language of freedom was invoked, but the deeper motive was containment of rivals, securing resources, ensuring dominance. And if we are honest, such contradictions did not vanish with the Cold War's end. They resurfaced in new forms. Wars waged in the name of stability, interventions justified as humanitarian acts, economic sanctions framed as moral necessities. The language is always lofty, but the logic behind it is often pragmatic and sometimes ruthless. India recognizes this dissonance. It sees the divide between what America declares as principle and what it practices as policy. And this recognition compels India to ask, is America's friendship rooted in shared values, or is it simply another arrangement of convenience? To ignore this question would be not AV. Nations, after all, are not bound by sentiment, they are bound by interests. But what makes America unique is its mastery of wrapping those interests in moral justification, which can disarm those who fail to look deeper. This is where India's maturity comes into play. To engage with America is not wrong, to hope for cooperation is not weakness. But to accept every word at face value is to risk being used in a narrative that ultimately serves someone else's purpose. India, therefore, must measure not only what America says, but what it consistently does. And when the two diverge, India must have the courage to trust action over rhetoric, reality over image. At its heart, this is a philosophical stance as much as it is a political one. It asks us to discern the difference between appearance and essence, between promise and pattern. The greatest danger lies not in America's self-interest, for all nations act in self-interest, but in mistaking that self-interest for shared destiny. If India fails to ask hard questions, it risks surrendering its agency to someone else's carefully constructed narrative. So the challenge is clear. India must see through the rhetoric, not with hostility, but with clarity. Because only by recognizing the patterns of self-interest hidden behind noble words can a nation safeguard its sovereignty. And the truth is this: those who confuse rhetoric with reality will always be led. Those who discern the difference will always lead themselves. T on the insights share. Throughout history, empires have always spoken the language of ideals while practicing the logic of power. It is a timeless paradox. Rome claimed it was spreading civilization, Britain claimed it was bringing enlightenment, and America, in our era, has claimed it is safeguarding freedom. Yet, when we peel away the rhetoric, what remains is often something very different: the pursuit of influence, the securing of economic advantage, the consolidation of strategic dominance. This is not to single out America alone, but it is to acknowledge the stark contradiction between the values it preaches and the actions it takes. And it is in that contradiction that India finds itself compelled to question not just American policy, but the very moral consistency of its global role. If America were judged purely on its ideals, it would stand as a beacon. The principles of liberty, equality, human rights, and opportunity are deeply inspiring. But when judged on its actions, the record becomes murkier. The support for authoritarian regimes when it serves strategic goals, the invasions justified in the name of peace that left instability in their wake, the economic policies that promoted free trade while protecting domestic interests. Each of these reveals the tension between principle and power. To the casual observer, this tension might be dismissed as inevitable, the messy reality of international politics. But for India, the question is deeper. Can a nation truly lead the world in moral authority if its actions consistently betray the ideals it proclaims? This is not merely a political problem, it is a philosophical one. For what is hypocrisy, if not the distance between words and deeds? And what is integrity, if not the alignment of the two? Nations, like individuals, cannot demand trust if they live in contradiction. The paradox of America is that it has been most persuasive in its words while most revealing in its actions. To admire the one without scrutinizing the other is to risk being deceived. India's questioning here is not antagonism, it is clarity. It is the recognition that if a partnership is to be meaningful, it must rest on truth, not illusion. For too long, the world has tolerated this divide between what America says and what it does, perhaps because America has been powerful enough to command that tolerance. But a new world is emerging, a multipolar world where no single nation holds unquestioned authority. In this world, illusions are dangerous and clarity is survival. So India insists on asking, will America reconcile its ideals with its actions, or will it continue to demand trust while offering contradiction? And more importantly, will India allow itself to be comforted by rhetoric, or will it demand alignment, coherence, and integrity? The lesson is unmistakable: words without deeds are shadows, and shadows cannot guide us forward. If India is to chart its course wisely, it must refuse to be guided by shadows. It must look for substance, for alignment, for truth. Because only when words and actions meet can trust be genuine, and only when trust is genuine can partnerships endure. India today stands in a position unlike any it has occupied before. For decades, it listened to narratives handed down from the West, narratives that often carried the implicit assumption that America's word was both final and benevolent. But those days are fading. India has awakened to its own strength, to its own capacity to shape not just its destiny, but the global order itself. This awakening is not born out of arrogance, it is born out of clarity. India has begun to recognize that genuine partnership does not mean deference, and questioning does not mean hostility. It means seeing reality as it is, not as others would like it to be seen. This clarity is grounded in confidence. Economically, India is no longer a peripheral player, it is a rising force whose growth cannot be dismissed. Strategically, it occupies a vital space in the balance of power, situated between great blocs and capable of tilting equations. Culturally and philosophically, India carries one of the world's oldest civilizational voices, a voice that has endured while countless empires have risen and fallen. This combination of economic strength, strategic significance, and civilizational depth has created a new foundation from which India speaks. And on that foundation, blind acceptance has no place. When India questions America's motives now, it does so from a position of maturity, not insecurity. There is no need to flatter, no need to fear, no need to cling. In fact, it is precisely because India values meaningful cooperation that it demands clarity. A partnership based on illusions or unspoken hierarchies would not be sustainable, and India understands this. It knows that for the future to be shaped on equal terms, it must first refuse the comfortable but dangerous habit of accepting another nation's words without scrutiny. Philosophically, this shift is profound. It reflects the transition from dependence to autonomy, from being a listener of narratives to a creator of them. To question in this context is not to undermine, it is to affirm independence. It is to say, we will engage with the world, but on terms that respect our dignity and intelligence. And this is perhaps the most important sign of India's growing maturity. It no longer seeks validation, it seeks balance. In the past, nations often aligned themselves with superpowers out of fear or necessity, trusting in promises that history later proved hollow. India has learned from that past. It has no intention of writing its future in another capital's language. Instead, it aims to shape partnerships that are transparent, mutually beneficial, and resilient to the shifting winds of politics. The message here is not one of defiance but of responsibility. To engage without questioning is to risk being led. To question without hostility is to ensure equality. India now recognizes that real strength is not measured only by economic growth or military power, but by the courage to speak with its own voice, even when that voice challenges long-established assumptions. And so the call is simple: let India no longer confuse politeness with silence, nor respect with submission. For only a nation that stands firmly in its own clarity can demand clarity from others. And only in that mutual clarity can true partnership ever be born. One of the most important lessons history offers is the danger of dependency. Nations that place their trust entirely in American promises have often discovered, sometimes painfully, that such promises last only as long as they serve Washington's interests. This is not a judgment against America alone, it is a reminder of how power operates. When the balance shifts, when priorities change, commitments can evaporate overnight. Those who depended too heavily found themselves exposed, caught in crises for which they were unprepared. India has observed this pattern, and it has drawn the right conclusion. The future cannot be built on another's motives. It must be built on one's own capacity to remain sovereign and self-directed. Dependency is seductive because it offers comfort. It gives the illusion of security, alliances, assurances, words of friendship. But comfort is not the same as strength. The moment's survival depends on someone else's decisions. Freedom is compromised. Nations, like individuals, cannot flourish in borrowed strength. They must cultivate their own resilience, their own capacity to withstand uncertainty, their own clarity of purpose. That is why India's questioning of America is not rooted in cynicism, but in responsibility. To accept support is one thing, to build a future on it entirely is quite another. Autonomy is not isolation. It does not mean withdrawing from partnerships or rejecting cooperation. It means engaging without surrendering agency. It means that India, when it chooses partnership, does so from a position of strength rather than need. This distinction is critical. A nation that depends on another is easily steered. A nation that stands on its own feet can negotiate, can question, can demand terms that respect its dignity. True cooperation flows from autonomy, not from dependency. Philosophically, this is a reminder of an old truth: freedom is not given, it is taken. It is preserved by vigilance, by discernment, by the courage to say no when needed. If India builds its destiny on America's motives, then it risks repeating the mistakes of others who discovered too late that loyalty was not mutual, But if it builds on its own capacity, its economy, its culture, its strategic vision, then no sudden shift in foreign policy can undo its progress. The world today is unpredictable. Alliances change, priorities evolve, and power centers shift. In such a world, dependency is fragility, but autonomy is resilience. India understands this. It recognizes that by questioning America's past motives, it is not closing the door on cooperation, but ensuring that any door open leads to a room built on equal terms. That is the wisdom of maturity, to learn from history, to refuse illusions, and to insist on agency above all. So the message is clear: India must never write its future in another's handwriting, for the destiny that lasts is always the one written by your own hand. And if India remembers this truth, then no power, no promise, and no shifting tide will ever dictate its course. India's questioning of America's motives ultimately arrives at a simple but urgent demand: transparency. In an age where information flows freely, where nations can no longer hide behind carefully controlled narratives, the old politics of hidden agendas is no longer sustainable. The world is shifting into a multipolar order, and in such an environment, clarity is not just desirable, it is essential. India understands this. It does not seek confrontation for its own sake. It seeks honesty as the foundation of any genuine partnership. When America makes commitments, India must ask, are these commitments truly aligned with shared principles, or are they calculated maneuvers wrapped in the language of friendship? History gives us reason to question, and wisdom demands that we continue to do so. Too often, noble words have been followed by actions that served narrower interests. Too often, promises of solidarity have given way to sudden withdrawals when circumstances changed. If America's motives are pure, then they should withstand scrutiny. If they are not, then India has no choice but to recognize the truth and act accordingly. Transparency is not about doubting for the sake of doubt. It is about ensuring that trust, if it is given, is anchored in reality. Philosophically, this call for transparency is rooted in the human need for authenticity. Just as relationships between individuals collapse under the weight of deception, so too do relationships between nations falter when motives are hidden. Authenticity builds trust, and trust builds endurance. Without it, partnerships are fragile, temporary, and ultimately destructive. India is not naive. It does not expect America, or any nation, to act without self-interest. What it does expect is honesty about that self-interest. Only when intentions are placed openly on the table can nations negotiate fairly, with dignity intact. This is especially critical now. In a world where power is no longer concentrated in one capital, multipolarity demands a new ethic of clarity. The days when one nation could claim unquestioned moral authority are over. Today, influence must be earned through openness, through integrity, through the willingness to be held accountable. By questioning America's motives, India is not simply protecting itself, it is helping shape this new ethic, a standard that insists great powers be transparent, not manipulative. And so, the issue is larger than India and America. It is about what kind of world we are building. Will it be one where hidden agendas dictate outcomes, or one where transparency allows nations to cooperate with mutual respect? India's insistence on clarity is not just a national stance, it is a global necessity. Because in a world built on mistrust, progress is fragile, but in a world built on transparency, partnerships can endure. The choice is stark, but the path is clear. If trust is to mean anything, it must survive the test of truth. And if India is to remain true to itself, it must never settle for shadows when it has the right to demand light.